So in the previous lecture, I was talking about how Waiting for Godot features or is placed in the tradition of playwriting, and what are some playwrights or plays by which Samuel Beckett may have been influenced while writing Waiting for Godot. So in this lecture, I'm going to continue with some key facts about the play, and I'm also going to give you an overview of the plot, following which we will talk about other aspects of the play, beginning with characters and themes. And I also want to have at least one full lecture on existentialism and absurdism as philosophies, right? So we have looked at them from the point of view of theater, from the point of view of theatricality, but we also have to look at them from the point of view of philosophy, because if we study theater of the absurd just as theater, just due to its stage work or just due to its absence of action or lack of action or its minimalism of stagecraft, we are going to miss out on absurdist philosophy, which is very related to existential philosophy, from where the idea or concept of the play is actually rooted. So these are some things we are going to discuss, but for now we are going to begin talking about some more key facts about the play. So the full title of the play, as you must be aware by now, is not Waiting for Godot. Rather, the full title is Waiting for Godot, a tragicomedy in 2 acts, right? So it was written around, it is believed to have been written around 1948 or 49, even though it was published a few years later. In fact, remember, since this is a play, the focus is not mainly on publication, but rather there is a greater degree of emphasis on when it was first performed, which you know it was in Paris in 1953, and then again in England, in London in 1955, which was directed by Peter Hall, and I have already mentioned that to you. So the play we know was written in Paris, and I think the first time it was published in the form of a book. And when I say published, remember that publication is distinct from performance. It was first performed in 1953, but it is believed to have been published in a book format in 1954. And the literary period is a bit dicey in this case, because when we look at the history of English literature or history of literature more generally, right, because you have to remember that this is a play which was originally written in French, but then it was translated by Samuel Beckett himself, right? So that convolutes the position of the play in terms of its language. But more importantly, the thing that becomes dicier or hazier, perhaps a degree more nebulous than most other plays that you will encounter, is the literary period where we should place this text or this play. Because see, when we talk about different periods in the history of English literature, most of the time it is not very difficult to place a certain text and to tell which period it belongs to. For example, if you pick up any work of Keats, I do not think an informed person, someone who studies English literature, will hesitate to say that Keats is an author, Keats is a poet from the Romantic period. If I pick up, say, if I pick up the novel Frankenstein, which you have read, and if I ask anyone who has the slightest degree of knowledge about the history of English literature, I'm sure that person will easily be able to tell us that Frankenstein is written during the Romantic period, right? Similarly, if you talk about other texts, in most cases it is not very difficult to say which period of the history of literature the text belongs to. But with Waiting for Godot, this becomes dicier, because on the one hand, there are people who believe that this is an extremely modernist text, but on the other hand, there are a lot of scholars, a lot of researchers, a lot of viewers even, and readers, who believe that placing this under the category or under the parasol of modernism is perhaps not the best of classifications, and perhaps the play is better fitted, it better fits the description of a postmodernist play. Now, you might ask, sir, what is the description of a postmodernist play? This is where it gets even dicier, And I believe to answer that question, to try and understand whether this play fits into the classification of modernism, or whether it fits into the classification of postmodernism, or whether it is even necessary for us to understand whether it belongs to either of these periods, is a different question altogether. And I believe that we should dedicate an entire lecture to discuss just that, to understand what modernism is. I'm sure you have all studied modernism as part of your CC1 course, but I believe now that you are in semester 6, more layers have to be added to what you have already learned. For all we know, you have forgotten most of what you have studied then, so it calls for revision anyway. So what we are going to do is to answer this particular question as to whether Waiting for Godot is a modernist play or a postmodernist play, or whether such a classification is even necessary for this play. We are going to dedicate a separate lecture where we are going to first talk about modernism, try and understand or rather revise what modernism is, and also talk about postmodernism next, right? And when we are able to see the distinctions between the two, then we are going to bring in Waiting for Godot, and then try and do what may be called litmus testing, right? And then see whether or not it fits into any of these categories. So essentially that is going to be a theoretical lecture where we are going to look at modernism and postmodernism. But for today's lecture, I'm going to continue with the other key facts. So as for the drama, as for the genre rather of this play is concerned, it is certainly drama, because there's a great deal of drama happening in the play, even though the action is minimal. When you read the play, you will see that there is a great deal of drama, and it is what we call a tragicomedy, as is implied in the title, a tragicomedy in 2 acts. And a tragicomedy, by definition, is a mixture of tragedy and comedy. So some of you have previously asked me, how can a tragedy be a comedy, right? How is it possible for something to be a tragicomedy, right? So by definition, of course, tragicomedy is a device which is used in writing, and it contains both tragedy and comedy. And mostly the characters in tragicomedies are exaggerated. And that is certainly true for Waiting for Godot. You'll find that the characters are extremely exaggerated, even though they have nothing to do. They are purposeless. Some of the things that they do during the course of the play seems extremely unrealistic and exaggerated, right? And sometimes in tragicomedies there might be a happy ending after a set of unfortunate events. And in Waiting for Godot, there are quite a few unfortunate events, and whether or not there is a happy ending is a little more difficult to answer, right? But the play is incorporated with jokes throughout the story, and these are not the jokes that you would encounter in typical comedy. You won't be encountering slapstick comedy when you read or watch Waiting for Godot. These are different kind of jokes, obviously. And what kind of jokes are they? These are very dark jokes, right? The humor is, sometimes called black humor or dark humor, and this is intrinsically tied up with existentialist or absurdist philosophy that I have mentioned a little while earlier. And like I said, I'm going to talk about that in greater detail in a later class, right? So the point that I'm trying to make now is tragicomedy is incorporated with jokes, and that does lighten the tone of the play. But then again, at the same time, there are unfortunate and tragic events happening during the entire course of whichever play is being called a tragicomedy. So generally speaking, Waiting for Godot has been considered as one of the great examples of tragicomedy, and there are many gestures, dialogues, actions, and situations in the play that are filled with pure comedy. And like I pointed out, that much of it is dark comedy, and there are a great number of musical devices as well, which have been used by different directors to create laughter. And remember, when we talk about musical devices, none of those are implied by Samuel Beckett while writing the play. The stage, like I have mentioned in a previous class, I compared Beckett with George Bernard Shaw in one particular aspect, and that aspect was detail. That aspect was the detail by which the stage has to be set. So if you read Shaw's plays, I've repeated this point before, but I'm going to tell it once more. So with Shaw's plays, you will see that there is a great deal of description given in the play itself. So those descriptions are related to what is to be done on stage, how are things to be arranged, what music is to be played, etc., etc. Right? But with Waiting for Godot, Samuel Beckett hasn't really supplied much of those. So where does all this music come from when the play is performed on stage? That comes from the director's, that comes from the director's head very much. So if you remember Peter Hall, whom I mentioned in the class where I introduced Waiting for Godot, if you remember that he was the man who directed it for its premiere in 1955 in London, he exaggerated silence, right? So he also used certain musical devices to create laughter, right? And musical devices are used to create laughter even today, right? From talk shows to sitcoms, right? And even in a large number of YouTube videos. So you will be familiar with the moments where a certain sound pops up, and that the intention of that sound popping up at a certain moment is to evoke laughter, right? So you must be familiar with that. Now, the overall atmosphere, like I said, is dark comedy. So, for example, in the play, Vladimir, one of the characters, is determined not to listen to Estragon's nightmare. So, Estragon is trying to tell him what his nightmare was, but Vladimir apparently is not interested in listening to it. However, Estragon keeps pleading with him to listen. So similarly, Estragon takes off and puts on his shoes several times while Vladimir plays with his hat again and again, right? So if you have the good fortune to see this play ever, you will notice this, but I'm sure there are quite a few performances available on YouTube. So do watch them. So on the other hand, comedy turns into tragedy due to the haplessness of these tramps, both Vladimir and Estragon, because both of them, they wait for somebody who does not come, which makes them disappointed. And during the course of time, they include or indulge themselves in extremely meaningless activities, right? And what those meaningless activities are, we're going to see while we focus on the play itself. All right. So the next key fact that I'm going to look at now is the setting of the play. So the side, the place where this play is set is an unidentified road near a tree, and at an unspecified time. These are things I have already mentioned, but one of the other things that stage directors have often added to the play is a piece of rock, right? So an unidentified road, an unspecified time. We do not know when this is happening in history, whether this is the 18th century or 19th century, or who knows, maybe 13th century. We have no idea whatsoever. But there is a tree on set, and that is implied in the text itself. Also, there seems to be a rock which is used by the characters to sit. So that is basically it. There is no further detail than that. Moving on, we will now talk about the climax of the play. And this is particularly interesting because Beckett's play essentially lacks a climax. So Vladimir and Estragon spend both acts, that is Act 1 and Act 2, waiting for the arrival of Godot, but Godot never arrives. Right? Now, the next point, the next key fact concerns antagonists of the play. Now, in a traditional play, in a play where there is a hero and there is a villain, obviously it's very easy to say who is the protagonist and who is the antagonist. But that becomes extremely nebulous while, in the case of a play like Waiting for Godot, or in absurdist plays more generally. So while Vladimir and Estragon speak of an anonymous they who threaten to beat them, you'll find references of these anonymous people in the play who threaten to beat them and from whom they must hide. There is no real antagonist in the play, right? So Vladimir and Estragon, they talk about these characters who will come and beat them, but they never appear. And during the course of the play, we do not see any real antagonist on stage. So part of the character's predicament or difficulty or the condition that they are in is that there is no precise cause or origin of the suffering and alienation they feel. Right. So there is alienation, but they are not sure why that alienation exists. There is suffering, but they do not know what is precisely causing their suffering. And since I mentioned the term alienation, I must also tell you that, and I think I have spoken about this when I mentioned Viktor Shklovsky and Russian formalism in a previous class. Alienation is something which these theorists have spoken about at great detail, and they have associated alienation as a quality of modern life, right? So modernity may have good things, but it also has bad things. And one of the terrible things about modernism or modernity is the alienation that it brings, right? So people will work from 9 to 5, and at the end of the day, they're going to feel alienated and detached from everything else in the world. So that is simply what modernism brings. And that is something the Russian formalists commented on. And it is used as a device by Bertolt Brecht, not so much by Samuel Beckett or the absurdist, but very much by Bertolt Brecht. And when you read his plays, you are reading one of his plays this semester, and you will surely see the alienation effect coming into play when he writes his plays. So apart from the key facts that I have already mentioned to you, I'm going to talk about a few more things, right? So you already know that Beckett originally wrote Waiting for Godot in French, and he said that writing in French made it easier to write in the blank and plain style for which the play is famous. And he later personally translated the play into English. But a lot of people often ask, why did Beckett write in French in the first place? Why did he not write in English first and then maybe translate it into other languages like French? So why did he write first in French? Now Beckett has answered that, and his answer is that French makes it easy to write blank and plain statements, right? So the minimalism that the play comes with is easier to deal with in French than in English, right? So this is a difference in language. Languages have their own qualities, languages have differences. There are, for example, some languages have gendered pronouns, other languages do not have gendered pronouns. So there are aspects of language which do factor in when an author, when a writer chooses which language to write in. Now with a multilingual author, right, like Samuel Beckett, it becomes a matter of choice, and here he has chosen French. So one more question that often pops up in the context of this play is, who is this Godot person or Godot, right? Waiting for whom? Vladimir and Estragon waiting for. So while Godot is such an important part of the play, there is widespread disagreement over the correct pronunciation of his name. Now some opt for stressing the first syllable, that is God-O, which emphasizes the name's link to God. There are others who choose to stress on the second syllable, that is God-O, Godot, right? So this is just how people pronounce this, and a lot of people will just say Godot or Godot, and there isn't much dispute about the pronunciation really, because Beckett never clarified, and even critics and viewers haven't really bothered about this part of the play, because since it is an absurdist play, this is not a very important thing anyway, right? So these are some of the things that I wanted to talk about in today's lecture, and in the next lecture we are going to move past these key facts and the other important information that I have shared with you, and we're going to look at the plot itself, right? So I will end this class here.